Hi there. Welcome. I'm Steve, and today I'm going to talk about something interesting. This time, aphantasia. Oddly, aphantasia is an experience of absence. It refers to not being able to imagine or remember or otherwise consciously bring to mind sense impressions. Sight, sound, hearing, smell, feeling. Most prominently, it's not being able to picture things. In this sense, it's been called having a blind mind's eye. The classic example, an apple. What do you picture when you think of an apple? What color is it? What variety? What size? Most people report experiencing an imagined image of a more or less specific apple with a vividness approaching seeing one in real life. But for people with visual aphantasia, there's nothing there, or only something dim and tentative. Thinking of an apple is a much more abstract, conceptual experience involving the idea of an apple and not the image of one. This can apply to any sense. When you have a song stuck in your head, do you literally play it back in your mind's ear? Or do you just have a vague impression of melody and lyrics? There aren't that many aphantasics. It's relatively rare. Most studies report that around 4% of people are at the weak end of the imagery spectrum, with 1% or fewer having no internal imagery at all. Adam Zeman's work was instrumental in popularizing the concept starting in about 2010. He's a neuropsychologist and a professor at the University of Exeter. He also coined the name aphantasia. The phenomenon, however, was recognized much earlier, explicitly in the 1880s by Francis Galton, who was a remarkable genius in polymath, and unfortunately for all of us, also the creator of eugenics. There are enough labs and researchers out there looking at aphantasia that results are being replicated and contradicted. Anatomical mechanisms are being proposed and argued over and investigated in functional MRI machines. I'm not going down those rabbit holes. What makes this something interesting to me is that people can have fundamentally different experiences of consciousness that can pass unnoticed for entire lifetimes. And it turns out that having or not having mental imagery has important emotional and cognitive implications above and beyond the experience of imagining or remembering. More on that later. Surprising no one, given how I'm talking, I'm aphantasic. I have total sensory aphantasia. I can re-experience none of my sense impressions. The old idea that trying not to think of an elephant is somehow a paradox never made sense to me. In a neurotypical brain that thinks in images, I assume a mental image of an elephant somehow appears and coexists with the negative logic, creating a sort of performative contradiction. For me, the sentence is pure logic and semantic meaning. Okay, I think, I'll just not think of an elephant. What's the big deal? I similarly realized that for years, guided meditations, especially from the insight in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, had never made any sense to me. One instruction that really sticks with me went something like this. Picture yourself next to a river, and when thoughts arise, just set them down in the water and let them float away. The best my mind can do to receive this sort of thing is to treat it as a metaphor, a vibe. It's a gentle and lovely approach to letting go of the thoughts that inevitably arise in meditation. But at no point am I seeing a river or feeling myself gently set my ruminations down to drift away. It's a helpful story, but not in any way a literal image for me. It's peculiar to realize that others experience thinking itself differently. We're well aware that other people think different things than we do. It's a banal, everyday, core tenet of human coexistence. So-and-so and I think differently is a totally normal thing to say. But we generally mean the content of the thoughts and not the mechanism of thinking, especially when it's socially invisible. Ironically, perhaps, aphantasia passes unseen, unlike, say, autism spectrum or ADHD. Folks with aphantasia, by and large, function in their personal and professional lives just like everyone else. Perhaps surprisingly, this even includes visual artists. Lacking internal images doesn't prevent us from being imaginative and creating art. Which means we all have to learn somehow that this difference in thinking even exists. Many of us discover aphantasia via the media. After a 2010 Discover magazine article reported on Siemens' single case study, he eventually heard from more than 21,000 aphantasics who reached out to his lab. I learned about it totally by accident a few years ago, when British comedian Richard Herring talked about it on his podcast Reholistapa. Others learn about it when they have frustrating encounters with visualization in therapy or meditation and think to compare their experience with others. All of this indicates that it requires making an effort to communicate our internal experiences to make this difference in how we think evident. It's a strange sort of reverse realization. Learning you're aphantasic isn't so much a moment of personal discovery. I mean, I've always just thought like this. Instead, it's a moment where you realize something about everybody else. It's like the TV and movie trope, where a teacher or a sergeant asks a lineup of people for a volunteer and everyone but one person steps backward. My experience hasn't changed, but everything around it has. You people all really meant it when you talked about practicing by visualizing your ski run, or calming down by picturing a beautiful beach, or getting to sleep by counting sheep. Us aphantasics have been assuming that it was all just a figure of speech or something. Not that sensory information or memory is meaningless in aphantasia. You'll note that I just used an extremely visual metaphor back there. That comedy forced to volunteer trope is 100% a visual gag. Being aphantasic doesn't mean not being able to think about things or remember things that are visual. I just can't re-experience them that way. I can sort of imagine what it must be like. I mean, I see and hear things all the time. I have a frame of reference. But the reverse isn't true. Some non-aphantasic people really find its existence perplexing. They regularly pop up on the Aphantasia subreddit to announce that they don't get how it's even possible to think without images. Sometimes these posts are obvious trolling, but often they express an earnest confusion about how non-sensory thinking is possible. And that's the thing about differences in consciousness itself. We can only directly know how our own minds operate. Realizing that other minds operate differently is uncanny. We constantly and implicitly make assumptions about the world and other people. This is largely invisible to us. The subconscious biases that structure our conscious experience protect us from the overwhelming complexity of the world, at the cost of simplifying it with generalizations. One of the most basic is that other people share our fundamental perceptual and cognitive framework. Anyone who's had to deal with serious mental illness themselves or in others will know that the most basic aspects of communication and shared understanding can break down in ways that are bizarre and disorienting. And I'll just get out ahead of this real quick. Aphantasia isn't a mental illness, but it does, in its more subtle way, show that we don't all have the same experience of consciousness in ways that are subtle, far-reaching, and hard to communicate. An early definition of aphantasia from Adam Zeman refers to a lack of specifically conscious wakeful imagery. It turns out that many folks with, say, visual aphantasia do have visual dreams, but can't then visually re-experience them, which honestly feels about as odd as it sounds. I don't remember many dreams, but when I do, they are often cinematic, epic. I can describe things that must have been sensory when they happened in my sleeping brain, leaping off a cliff wearing a tuxedo, James Bond style, for example. But in my waking conscious recollection, all that remains are ideas, words, impressions. My remembered dreams are short stories, not short films. It's currently thought that dreaming allows us to consolidate and store our memories. The brain files and sorts and distinguishes between new and familiar aspects of our day's experiences. It uses our sensory processing mechanisms to do so, which results in dreaming. This implies that our capacity for mental imagery is deeply connected to what and how we remember. Importantly, memory isn't just one thing. Well before aphantasia came on the scene, research had demonstrated that we experience distinctly sensory, spatial, and factual forms of remembering. In some ways, aphantasia research has helped confirm and clarify those distinctions. Aphantasics test largely normally on factual memory. More confusingly, we also have seemingly average spatial memory. This means I can't close my eyes and picture my home, but I can describe its layout and its contents no problem. It turns out that knowing where things are is different from being able to imagine what they look like. One particular memory system is strongly affected by internal imagery: autobiographical memory, or what it means to remember being me. Autobiographical memory is usually defined as a combination of semantic and episodic memory that contributes to our sense of self. Semantic memory refers to retaining general facts about the world. Episodic memory is more experiential. It refers to retaining and re-experiencing scenes, moments, events from a first-person point of view. Re-experiencing events when you remember them is apparently normal. Being unable to do so has been named severely deficient autobiographical memory, or SDAM, by Brian Levine and his research team in Toronto. It turns out that there's a lot of overlap between aphantasia and SDAM. Lack of imagery is tightly coupled with weak episodic memory. I know, for example, that I sang the part of Mr. Sowerberry in Oliver when I was in grade 8. I don't remember actually doing it. I can't tell you what it was like. And so it goes for the rest of my life. Even the basic facts get pretty fuzzy more than, say, a decade back. Moments like my brief musical theater career persist more stubbornly, perhaps because they were documented, and because they remain exceptional. And many of my childhood memories seem to be of photos, and not of the events themselves. Now that I'm middle-aged, most of my life has receded into ambiguous oblivion. This lack of vivid remembering is a major source of the dismay many feel about being aphantasic. It's not easy to realize that the past is more fully and completely gone for you than for other people. Especially, the idea of being able to retain and retrieve a loved one's face or hear their voice is incredibly compelling. It's upsetting to think that when my loved ones die, I won't be able to bring them to mind again. I'll know about them at our shared experiences. I'll appreciate their enduring presence in having shaped my life and who I am, but I'll have to rely on photos and videos to preserve their voices and faces, and that's a melancholy and isolating feeling. There is an upside. Perhaps counterintuitively, people with SDAM are likely to function better as they age. Because in aging, people tend to lose their episodic memories. Some of us never had them to lose, and have developed other mechanisms that let us remember in our own way. Aphantasia can affect our emotions, as well as our imagination and our memories. Aphantasics are more likely to be on the autism spectrum. The reverse is also true. People with autism tend to experience reduced mental imagery. Autism aside, aphantasia can have subtle effects on what it means to witness and understand others' emotions. When encountering stories that are purely verbal, aphantasics report less sympathetic emotional responses. In tests involving images, however, aphantasics can accurately detect others' emotions, but tend to be slower to pick up on them. Unlike people with alexithymia, where emotional responses are present but unrecognized, aphantasics seem to be less responsive in the first place, as well as worse at recognizing our own emotions. Paradoxically, it looks like people with complete aphantasia are less impaired in terms of emotional self-knowledge. This might be because the complete absence of imagery has forced us to function using alternative cognitive mechanisms. And on a more positive note, there's mixed evidence that aphantasia can be protective against PTSD. Aphantasics also experience fewer negative emotions such as fear or disgust from textual or verbal descriptions. Not being able to envision fictional or traumatic horrors prevents them from having as much impact. They don't live on in our minds in the same way. Aphantasics can react pretty strongly when they realize that others have a rich inner sensory life that's denied them. Online aphantasia communities are full of stories of anger and frustration, and they offer resources to help people come to terms with it. My own realization was pretty matter-of-fact. I found some relief in understanding why visualization exercises never made any sense. But I see a lot of people react with dismay, anxiety, and envy. These negative reactions can themselves have an impact on mental health. This has led some researchers to argue more caution about the tests and definitions and criteria for aphantasia, especially the more DIY versions found online. Because there isn't really a formal diagnosis. What most folks do is take some version of the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire, the VVIQ, and run with it. But there are different versions of this questionnaire, and research studies use inconsistent scoring cutoffs, so aphantasia means different things to different people. One recent study found that a large proportion of people who self-diagnose as aphantasic actually score relatively normally on a formally administered VVIQ. And these kinds of self-image and self-labeling really matter. To take one example, expectations about memory can affect performance in memory testing. Belief can become reality. So, not only is it hard to comprehend how other people think, it can be difficult to accurately recognize and describe what's going on in our own minds. And what we think is going on when we think can affect how we think. The core defining aspect of aphantasia, thinking and remembering without images, is oddly hard to communicate and even to recognize, and it poses very few practical problems. Its connection with memory and emotional impairment can have more serious implications for our lives and our relationships. But it's hard to know how to interpret these probabilistic associations and potential problems in the context of a lived individual life. If I see myself as relatively unemotional, is it a result of aphantasia, or having been socialized as male under misogynistic patriarchy that encourages boys and men to deny most of their feelings? Similarly, if I don't remember many details from my life, does this suggest memory impairment, or am I perhaps just inattentive or unpracticed at recall? And more generally, how do I know? What am I comparing myself against? The relationship between the correlations seen in research and the specific existential reality of my own life is inherently uncertain. Science can reveal a lot about general patterns and probabilities, but when it comes down to living a life, we have to clearly take stock not only of our own experience, but the assumptions we bring to that experience, including how we relate to other people and the varied ways their minds might work. Cognitive diversity complicates the perpetual existential quandary of relating to others, of making common sense of our shared world. I find the concept of neurodiversity helpful in negotiating these things. I've seen some pretty heated discussions online about whether aphantasics are or are not neurodivergent. Most of the objections relate to people not feeling disabled, which seems to completely miss the point. Neurodiversity is a perspective recognizing that human capacities and experiences fall on a spectrum. It says that our traditional ideas about what is normal are narrow, constraining, and stigmatizing. We're much too quick to label variation as diseased or disabled. Zeman refers to aphantasia as a variation on normal cognition, largely because most people who identify as aphantasic live normally. But now that we've started to identify and name these things, it seems easy to gravitate to a deficiency model, to judge our experiences as lacking compared to the norm. The idea of simple difference is surprisingly hard to hold on to. We seem inclined to create arbitrary and harmful hierarchies. Labels like neurotypical or neurodivergent are intended to cut through that. They invite us to see experiences like aphantasia as part of the kaleidoscope of human being. Not as something deficient, but rather as something interesting. Thanks for listening. Something Interesting is an audio essay anthology about how strange and complicated it is to be a person in the world. It explores the philosophical, the political, and the personal. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced by me, Steve McCullough. Check the show notes for my sources, further reading, and music and art credits. Please direct all correspondence to thesomethinginterestingpod@gmail.com. And may your days be full of interesting somethings.